Good afternoon, everyone. All right. Well, I hope you all had a good weekend. Today we're just going to have a fairly longer lecture, so kind of bear with me and try to stay as attentive as possible, and please don't pack up till the end, okay? Anyways, so one thing that's not on this general reminders list is do remember that your Connecting with Biology assignment is due tonight at 11:59. If you want to do well on it, follow the rubric. Pay attention to the directions, because more than likely, if it's out of, if there's weird formatting things or stuff like that, we're not as able to give you, it's going to be more difficult for us to find the things that we're looking for and give you a decent grade. So please make sure you're following the directions. And if you don't have, and if you have a question, ask. Yes, I do mean 500 characters, which usually equates to about 150 to 200 words. You can go a little bit beyond that. I'm not going to sit there and count out every single word. But if it's a page long, I know it's too long. All right. So, and you will lose points for that. Yes. No. She asked if you have to worry about the character limit thing for video formats. Video formats are slightly different. I'm looking for about somewhere between 30 seconds to a minute. It can go a little bit longer than that again, but no more than a full TikTok's video. So no more than 3 minutes. If you're going farther than that, you're talking too much. Remember, there's 450 of y'all. I'm trying to get through these as quickly as possible. And the whole point is, right, you're taking this big, long scientific paper and digesting it down to the bullet points. This is what it's about. This is what they did. This is what they found. And this is why it matters. And then have a little bit of fun with the creativity side of it. Yeah. Upper limit, yes. So, I mean, if you can get it under 500 characters, I'd be impressed, because consistently the email that I get is, I'm over 500, what can I do? And I'll be like, yeah, get it as close as you possibly can. But if you're writing a full paragraph or a page, that's too much. It needs to be somewhat succinct and concise, because that's the important part here. Because, right, so for instance, if we're talking about these tweets in the real world, nobody's going to read a paragraph, right? Or, giant page long description. That's for Facebook, that's for real people. We're not ranting about politics. We're talking about cool science. We want to be short and concise so we can get that point across and move on. That's why TikTok is a really cool platform. So I don't know if y'all noticed this, and there's a really interesting video that talks about the different eras of YouTube. But YouTube now, all the major creators have gone to almost 15 plus, upwards of 45 minutes now. And so you almost have to watch everything with double speed if you. And that's why TikTok is doing so better than YouTube comparatively. They have the less beneficial revenue sharing agreement. So just some cool stuff about how all that social media stuff works. All right. Any other questions about that assignment? And again, like I said, I'm happy to answer any questions you'll have. Email me if you have them. Do keep in mind, though, that usually after around 5 or 6, I don't check my emails often. I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible, but if you're working on this and you don't start till 11 o'clock, there may be a chance that I'm not going to be able to get back to an email that you send me at 11:59. So just keep that in mind. And again, I always try to answer them as soon as I get them, but yeah, I'm an adult, I'm a human. I like to have a regular life outside of this class. Surprise. Also, don't forget, like always, quiz 6 is going to be due on Sunday. It really shouldn't be this hard at this point to remember when these things are due. Let me know if you have any questions or if there's anything off. I know a couple of y'all struggled a little bit with the synapse question. It wasn't the synapse that was it. It was the axon. The axon's what's actually sending the signal, not the synapse. I tried to make this point clear during the lecture, but the point that I was trying to make is the synapse is just that space in between where those two cells sit. Yes, things move through that space, but it's not what's sending things out. It's just that space in between. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. Also, Exam 2 is coming up on Friday, October 8th. So that's not this Friday, but next Friday. There will be a review on Wednesday of that week during our normal scheduled lecture time in here. If you have, you need to bring in questions or we'll just finish the class early. Those of y'all that can't make it, obviously we'll save the video for you. But another thing to keep in mind too is if you don't feel comfortable like bringing questions up here and asking them in front of everybody, just shoot me an email with it and I'll answer it there. Or I can, and that way I'll just reiterate the same answer I gave to you in that email later on. So I know not everybody feels comfortable being in front of like a big class like that. So if you have questions, ask them. I'd much rather you have you ask them now than after the test, because that's going to suck for you and for your grade. Does anybody else have any questions? Yes. Exactly. So here's the deal with exam 2. It will be the same general style of questions. One thing that I'm hoping, and I'm still waiting on getting, I was supposed to meet with my advisor last week, but I had to get to this week. I'm hoping to put it online and only print out like 50 copies for those of you that want to take it in here, but I assume most of y'all would rather take it online at your leisure. If it's online, it'll be open from 12:01 o'clock or Friday morning until 11:59 on Friday evening, so you have the full day to take it. It'll be a 40-question test, and you'll have 15 minutes to take it. Really straightforward, the exact same style of questions that you've seen. Again, just like all of our other tests, it's going to be closed book, closed note. So unfortunately, I do have to use the Respondus browser. So if you'd rather just not deal with that, you're more than welcome to come and take it in here. I know it's a pain in the ass. I don't particularly care for it, but can't cheat, right? And that's the only option I really have in that case. So it's up to you. Hopefully we'll be able to do that online option for most of y'all if you want it. But if not, we can always just do something. However, there is a chance that the biology department will say, I cannot do that. And that means we'll be having an in-person test. So plan for an in-person test and hope for the online one, if that makes any sense. So with this exam, right, it's going to be a little bit, and this is how I would recommend stuff. First things first, start with the lecture PowerPoints. Read through them and kind of be quizzing yourself as you're going through. What does a synapse mean? What does an axon mean? What does all these things mean? Then, what you're going to do is, this works for some people, not for everybody, so bear with me. Flashcards. You can do it through the Quizlet program or just do it in general. I'm sure somebody probably has them uploaded somewhere on Quizlet, but I caution you against that, just because it's usually helpful just to make it. We use that to study the vocabulary words. There's a lot of them this test that you need to know, because there's a big difference between how you interpret things just based off of the definitions themselves. There's just a lot of gray area. Well, even if we do an online one, but so. All right. But yes, once you've gone through all those study materials, then you go back and look at the previous quizzes, not at what you, don't look at your answers and go through and answer them honestly. And if you do fairly well on that, you should be okay. But that's the thing is, I really want to stress that there's a lot of material here and to not kind of wait till the last minute to start memorizing some of these things. And honestly, a lot of them are important to know. Like, I know somebody that took this class the previous year and then started having thyroid problems. And the only reason they knew to talk to their doctor about the specific symptoms they were feeling is because they were paying attention during that specific lecture. So you never know when this shit might come up. It's kind of useful, especially as we're going through all these different systems. It's important to know how your body works, right? Because you never know what weird stuff can happen. Also, don't forget, if you're really, really concerned about your grade, try the extra credit. It's really not that hard. It's very explicit what I'm asking you for. So if you don't do it, I'm going to tell you, sorry, that's not how to actually turn it in. But, just read through, make sure you're following the rubric for that. It's really easy. All you have to do is go out, find 10 things, take a picture of it, upload it put it into a Word document and call it a day. It's really not hard. Yes. No. So it's kind of a little bit of a gray area because you will find things that pop up like weeds and stuff like that in flower beds that are totally fair game. But if it's clearly intentionally planted there, it's not allowed because that's horticulture, right? It's not supposed to be there. So, and I do try to weed those out when I find them. And I'll let you know if like, yeah, that one doesn't count. But yeah, don't post like 6 pictures of animals from a zoo and try to pass that off. That's not going to work. All right. Any other last minute questions? Yes. So quiz 7 is going to be almost like a review for the test. So yes, it will cover about 5 questions from that lecture setup or from that lecture before the test. But I'm going to have some other questions in there that might be more than likely to show up on the exam compared to other questions, just especially ones that say you missed a number of people miss. Like, I don't know, what's the next question? Just things to think about. But I promise I don't try to purposely make these things difficult. Okay. Any other questions? Cool. All right. So hopefully it actually work today. Today we're going to be talking about the circulatory and the respiratory systems. These are both critically important, primarily because they're involved with cellular respiration and moving those products around, right? And because these systems are so interconnected with each other, we're just going to talk about them together. Pretty straightforward. So what exactly are these systems for? These systems are there to work together to provide body with oxygen, as well as removing CO2 outside of the body, and basically kind of get those materials in and out of the body so you can actually undergo proper cellular respiration. Obviously, as you remember from that first couple of lectures, we need oxygen to make ATP. That whole process of cellular respiration is you're using oxygen and some sort of sugar molecule, and you're going to break that down to release the ATP, and it's going to generate as other products, CO2 and water. So in this case, the oxygen is a reactant. It's required for that aerobic cellular respiration to occur. And thus you need that oxygen to travel to the mitochondria inside of those cells where that final electron receptor can be at the end of the electron transport chain in order for all this stuff to function. So not only do we have to bring in that oxygen, obviously we have to get rid of all those waste products. So one of the ways that we do that is by expelling the CO2 when we breathe out. So carbon dioxide is that waste product from cellular respiration, and our bodies have no real use for it. We're not a plant, right? We can't use it for photosynthesis. And thus it's released from those mitochondria during cellular respiration, diffuses out of the cell into the blood, and then the blood carries that back to your lungs. That CO2 then gets processed out as gas. And additionally, you often release some of that excess water that you don't need through usually your breathing and all that kind of fun stuff too. Although it's not as concentrated to try to get rid of water, because more often than not, you need more of it than what you have. Now, your blood is going to be traveling through the circulatory system. Your heart's the central pump for everything. It's going to move blood through the vessels, both the arteries and the veins. And these blood vessels are going to carry the blood to the respiratory surfaces where blood exchanges with gas and with the environment, and ultimately the environment. They're also then going to take all this blood and move it around to the body tissues, where the body tissues are going to exchange those gases and nutrients, and then that's going to be sent back to the heart and to the lungs to get rid of the stuff that they don't need. Now, blood is closely connected to a lot of other organ systems. Obviously, blood is there to carry gases that are exchanged for the respiratory system and ultimately for cellular respiration. You're going to use the nutrients that come out of your digestive system. You're going to move them into your bloodstream so that way they can move around the body a lot faster. And things like blood are going to be circulated through the kidneys, which are going to help pull out all that excess water and get rid of it through excretion. And finally, bloods are going to be there to help carry hormones and all that sort of fun stuff from your endocrine system around and move it to the effector, to the target cells within a particular tissue system that you need. Now, blood is made up of a bunch of different components. Ultimately, it's a bunch of cells suspended in what we call plasma. This blood consists of red blood cells, white blood cells, and these platelets. The cells in this blood produce this liquid extracellular matrix called plasma. Now, plasma is primarily water, but it also contains antibodies that come from the white blood cells, as well as many other dissolved substances. That's where all those nutrients are going to be hanging out usually. Now, the red blood cells are going to be there for carrying oxygen. I know most of y'all already know a lot of this stuff, so bear with me. Now, red blood cells are the only cells in the body that can express something called hemoglobin, and that's going to be that specific protein that's there to bind to oxygen. Now, hemoglobin is also what gives red blood cells their dark red color. That's kind of what makes them a little bit more distinct. Those red blood cells are going to originate from stem cells in the red bone marrow, like we talked about in the previous lecture. And as they mature, they're going to lose all of their other organelles and fill up with as much hemoglobin as possible. Basically, at some point during their development, they go from being a typical functioning cell to just a cellular membrane with a bunch of extra proteins to move stuff in and out. That's all they're designed to do. In fact, mammals in particular, our red blood cells do not have a nucleus because it's lost that as a way to save more space for those hemoglobins to bind oxygen and keep that within your cells. And as a result, if you were to try to do Jurassic Park with a mammoth, you couldn't do it because you're not going to be able to get those the DNA from those red blood cells from that mosquito that potentially bit it, right? You can do that with lizards, you can do that with birds, you can't do that with mammals because it doesn't have that nucleated red blood cell. Now, white blood cells are going to be primarily part of the immune system. They're going to be there to fight infection. And we're going to go into a lot more detail on the immune system a little bit later this week. Now, blood cells, these white blood cells contain 5 different types, and they also are known as leukocytes. Cytes meaning cell, leuko meaning pretty straightforward, right? These white blood cells are again part of the immune system, and they're going to be there for provoking inflammation as well as destroying microbes among many other functions. So they're there to recognize pathogens, attack pathogens, and potentially promote particular types of reactions where you're going to engulf either pathogens or some sort of impalement, that kind of thing. Probably, and again, I kind of want to reiterate that inflammation in all cases isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, too much inflammation can be. So you have to be somewhat selective with your immune system response. Because obviously, if you respond with a shit ton of inflammation, that's when you get things like anaphylactic shock, where your entire body is going to shut down because you can no longer bring in oxygen because all of your primary airways have swollen shut because of inflammation. So that's why it's important to kind of consider that and how much it's kind of like with all chemicals that we ever absorb into our body, right? There is such thing as too much of a good thing, right? At some point, you can drink too much water and die from drinking too much water. Same kind of thing with this inflammation. And you have platelets. And platelets are literally just there to help clot blood. So if you have some sort of puncture to the veins or the arteries, that's there to try to quickly stop it from bleeding out as quickly as possible. These are small, colorless cell fragments that initiate blood clotting when there's a wound. And these platelets form a clump that temporarily plugs the leak. These are going to act as a positive feedback loop. So as a couple of platelets start binding, more and more platelets are going to bind to it, and ultimately it's going to get to the point where it seals off that section of the vessel, if it can do that, because that's not always possible given the size of blood vessels or size of arteries. Just depends. These are going to attract plasma proteins called clotting factors that are then going to trap other blood cells and platelets and forming that blood clot. So ultimately, you've got a couple platelets will bind. They'll send out these information that, hey, there's an issue here. We need to keep binding to this. And it'll drag other blood cells to ultimately where it completely clots off that area. Now, the blood has a very diverse function in your body. Obviously, the main function of the plasma is to exchange water and dissolved substances with fluids that surround the body's cells. And these cells depend on this exchange to maintain homeostasis in their levels of water, salts, and other nutrients, specifically things like oxygen and CO2. In other words, this is the backbone of your body. And this, not in the physical sense, of course, but in the metaphorical sense of like, this is what keeps you alive. If you fuck this up, you will die. Pretty straightforward. And here you can kind of see a general breakdown of all these different things that your blood is responsible for And so it's not just a prop that you paint on at Halloween Horror Nights, it's something that's really important and important to mention. Keep a lot of these concepts in mind. We've already touched on a lot of them. I'm not going to go and read through every single one. Let's do a quick review question. So which of these components of blood is matched correctly with one of its functions? You have a red blood cell, which is initiating clotting, white blood cell, which is producing antibodies, platelets, which carry oxygen and carbon dioxide, and D, plasma, which engulfs and destroys foreign substances. Should be a pretty straightforward one, right? Let's talk about why the other ones are wrong, right? What carries oxygen and carbon dioxide? Good. What about plasma? Does it engulf and destroy foreign substances? What does it? Perfect. So the answer is B. Okay. Now, the circulatory system ranges from simple to complex, and it kind of depends on what organism you're talking about. And there's some really cool examples for adaptations of this, especially that allow particular organisms to handle certain stresses from their environment. For instance, crocodiles and alligators have a specialized part of their heart that instead of having a traditional 4-chambered heart, like you think of in mammals, they have it's technically a 3-chambered heart, but they have the ability to shut off one of those chambers and divide it into 2, which allows them to send all that blood just back and forth to the rest of the body, and it doesn't have to go back into the lungs and exchange gas constantly. And what that allows them to do is, if you're not sending that blood to the extra parts of the body where it doesn't need it, it can then save all that oxygen and keep it through the rest of the body, and allows them to stay underwater for a much more extended period of time. It's really cool. Some animals, such as flatworms and cnidarians, they don't really have a true circulatory system at all. All their fluids are just kind of floating around in their body, which makes them really vulnerable to puncture wounds. Thus, their cells are going to conduct all of their gas and nutrient exchanges via diffusion, which is incredibly inefficient and is one of the reasons why they don't get big. Some circulatory systems are going to be what we call open. Now, this basically means that it has a heart or some sort of similar kind of functioning organ, and it has kind of the starts and ends of these different veins or vessels. And what happens is it kind of flows into a large central hub, and the central hub has a lot of interactions with all the different body parts, and ultimately it goes back into the heart at some point as well. It's kind of like if you ever played the game Roller Coaster Tycoon, if you've ever done like mess around with some of the boats, there's these little tracks that you can put on them, but at some point they can just go off of those tracks. Now, kind of like that game and in real life, this blood doesn't always efficiently move around. And so as a result, you can have, platelets or blood getting stuck in particular areas and not being efficiently moved around as what you would want. So at least from a vertebrate-centric perspective, I think we have the better system. Then you can have these systems which become closed. Now, in a closed circulatory system, the blood remains in the vessels the entire time. And it's going to rely on diffusion in and out of those vessels to move the nutrients and oxygen and all that stuff in and out without having to actually physically contact the other cells. Now, you find this very classically in vertebrates. Pretty much all vertebrates have a closed circulatory system, but these are distinguished based off in vertebrates. How we distinguish how all this stuff is set up is based off of the number of heart chambers specifically, because obviously all the vessels and arteries and all that kind of fun stuff stay the same. It's the heart that differs. Now, in what we call the lower vertebrates, or honestly the better vertebrates, you get things like fish and amphibians. They're only going to have primarily a 2-chambered heart, where all it's designed to do is bring blood in and bring blood out. And it's not going to subdivide what's going to the lungs or or in case of a lot of these animals, gills, versus what goes to the rest of the body. Pretty much it's all going the same, general pathway. However, when you get to things like birds and mammals, you're going to develop this 4-chamber system that separate the heart into an additional layer. And so you've still got blood coming in and out of the heart, but you're doing it twice. You've got blood that's going out of the heart into the circulatory or into the respiratory system, where it's going to pick up oxygen, back into the heart, and then out to the rest of the body. Comes back out from the rest of the body into another chamber of the heart, into the lungs, and back. It basically kind of forms almost like a figure 8. Now, these fish and larval amphibians are a little bit more likely to use this two-chambered heart because they're going to be using a lot more things like gills or especially with a lot of amphibians that rely on skin for the respiration. So they don't necessarily have a centralized point that they need to pump air to. You do see the added lungs in amphibians, but usually and thus you just need that single circuit instead of having to subdivide it into a second circuit. But in birds and mammals, this blood is pumped into a double circuit, which moves from the heart to the lungs, then returns the heart to be pumped back out to the rest of the body, and then back into the heart and through the lungs. Again, that figure 8 motion, like I mentioned. Here you can actually see how some of this heart morphology changes. Finally, birds and mammals, we have very classic, distinct 4-chambered hearts. Again, this cardiovascular system is your transportation network. The plasma, the cells, the platelets, all that make up the blood, which are there to circulate through your body in an elaborate system of blood vessels and keep you functioning. And now blood vessels are usually classified by what direction of blood they flow. Are they moving away from the heart? Are they moving towards the heart? Or are they the low pressure areas where they're kind of intermingling between the two? So arteries and arterioles are going to be there to carry blood away from the heart, whereas veins and venules carry the blood back to the heart. Think artery away, pretty straightforward. Now these capillaries are going to be the smallest section of blood vessels. This is going to be where you're actually going to get that diffusion of water and dissolved substances, where you're going to be taking those things out of the blood and putting them into the cells and vice versa. So between each of these capillaries and interstitial fluid is going to be there to bathing the blood, or bathing those body cells with all those nutrients that are coming out of the blood. Now, unsurprisingly, there's a bunch of different kinds of tissue that make up your circulatory system. And as always, it kind of gets broken down into those 4 main categories. You have epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle. Now, epithelial, muscle, and connective tissues are going to make up the components of the circulatory system, while the nervous system tissue there is going to be there to regulate the activity of the circulatory system. So for instance, when it comes to epithelial tissues, you're usually going to find those in the inner linings of the heart wall. It's going to line the veins and the arteries, as well as making up the capillary walls. For connective tissue, this is going to be surrounding the heart, and it's going to form the outer layers of veins and arteries, usually because it's a little bit more dense and a little bit less prone to damage. Nervous tissue is obviously going to be there to regulate the heart rate and pressure based off of what it's detecting in your body. And finally, the muscle, which is there going to be creating your heart wall, as well as all your other cardiac muscles, and things like the smooth muscle forms, the middle layer of your arteries and your veins, so that way they can stretch a little bit, as well as your skeletal muscles, which are going to be there to help control the blood in the veins. Another quick review question. Which of the following statements about the human circulatory system is true? A, diffusion occurs rapidly across the artery walls into the blood cells, or the body cells. B, veins always carry blood away from the heart. C, our circulatory system is open because the lungs are open to the atmosphere. Or D, the heart pumps blood directly into the arteries. Why is A wrong? Where is diffusion actually occurring? Capillaries, right? What about B? Why is B wrong? It occurs in the arteries, right? That's what's moving stuff out of your heart, not the veins. The veins are bringing it back. What about C? Why is that just totally wrong? Yeah, we've got a closed system. All our blood is staying in the vessels the entire time. Yeah, they interact with the lungs, but it's not like the blood is going into the lungs, unless there's real deep shit. And finally, D, obviously the heart pumps blood directly into the arteries, arteries away. That is the correct answer. So the heart is a muscular pump, and it's going to contain 4 chambers. Atrium, like the atrium in your house, right? That's going to be where you're going to receive blood from the veins. Where the ventricles are going to be pumping them back out into arteries. And you can actually see all this different breakdown. We're not going to go too much into detail of learning every single little part of the heart, but understand the general basis of what's an atria and what's a ventricle. Now, the right half of the heart in mammals and birds is there to receive blood from the body and pump it to the lungs. So your right atria is going to be pulling in blood from your veins that have just come out from the rest of your body, with the right ventricle then pushing that blood into your lungs. Whereas your left half of your heart is going to be there to receive blood from the lungs and then pump it out to the rest of the body. In other words, your left atria is going to pull in the blood from the lungs, which is one of the few times that you have a vein coming back into the heart that's actually oxygenated. Because again, it's coming into the heart, right? But it's actually the one time you're going to find where it's completely opposite. And then finally, that left ventricle is then going to push that oxygenated blood out to the rest of your body. Now your heart needs a blood supply too. You can't go without it, right? So the coronary artery is going to branch off from the aorta and bring very oxygen-rich blood to your heart. And a vein entering the right atrium returns that blood that has been circulating within the walls of the heart. Ultimately, the blockage of the coronary artery is the most common kind of heart attack. Given how much blood moving from your aortic artery to the rest of the heart and back into the vein. It's pretty easy to block it, despite having a fairly large blood supply. Now, ultimately, blood gets from the oxygen, gets its oxygen from the lungs. The oxygen-poor blood is going to enter the right atrium. It is pumped to the right ventricle. The blood then moves through the pulmonary arteries in the lungs, where it's going to pick up as much oxygen as possible and load all that CO2 that's built up inside of it. And then the pulmonary veins are going to carry the oxygen-rich blood from the lungs back to the left atrium of the heart. Now, once that oxygen-rich blood enters that left atrium, it's then going to be pumped into the left ventricle, which is then pumped out to the rest of your body through contractions in that left ventricle, which is going to send blood into the aorta, which is your base kind of beginning of your true arteries. And it's the largest artery in your body because it's this giant curve that massive curve that you see coming out of your heart. That's the aorta. You see all the different branches. You will bleed out in 20 seconds. Finally, that blood's going to circulate through the rest of your body before ultimately returning back to the veins in your right ventricle. Now, the cardiac muscle itself is what we call self-excitable. That means that the cardiac muscle cells contract in unison without input from the central nervous system. You're not sitting here thinking about how to control your heart. Your heart just kind of does its own thing. As a result, you generate these cardiac cycles, which is a single beat of the heart, which consists of the events that occur when each contraction and relaxation of the heart muscle. If you ever listen to your heart pumping, right? So, da-da, da-da. What you're hearing is all of those various things as your heart contracts. Now, the signal to contract is actually going to begin what we call the SA node. This SA node is also known as the pacemaker, and it's the region of a specialized cardiac muscle cells in the upper wall of the right atrium. And each time the cells of the SA node fire, they stimulate the cardiac cells of the atrium to contract. This is one of the reasons why if you ever put in a pacemaker, that's where they put it. It's like right on top of that, and it uses an electrical signal to artificially stimulate that area. Ultimately, the signal is going to be passed down to the AV node, which is where the ventricles fill. It's a relay station called the atrioventricular node. That's going to conduct that electrical stimulation throughout the ventricle folds. The cardiac cells of the ventricles then contract together. And that heartbeat sound that you hear is going to come from the valves opening and closing. So as those contractions happen, they open and close valves within the heart. Each of these heartbeat, you're hearing two sets of those heart valves opening and closing, producing that lub-dub sound. Ultimately, things like exercise can be there to help strengthen your heart. The amount of blood that you pump each minute is called the cardiac output. And the stronger your heart is, the more blood it can pump with the fewest number of times, right? You want to be able to move blood as efficiently as possible. So moving as much blood as possible and as few pumps as possible is what you're looking for. And you can really get to that by just a lot of cardiac training, and specifically as a lot of aerobic activities in particular kind of promote that. Now, the strong heart muscles are going to pump more blood with each stroke than weaker muscles. Another quick review question here. Red blood cells are in the heart's right ventricle. When it next enters the heart, which heart chamber will it enter? Why is it not the right atrium? Let's just. It's coming out of your right ventricle, which means that it's going to your lungs, which means it's going to come back through your left ventricle, or sorry, your left atrium. Now, arteries specifically will have a thick layer of smooth muscle. Now, as the blood pressure is leaving the heart is extremely high, which is one of the reasons why if you cut an artery, it often, like every freaking TV show you ever see, if you cut an artery, you see a giant spurt of blood coming out. It's because the amount of pressure that's coming out of your heart is a lot higher than it is going back. So as a result, arteries need that smooth muscle to help withstand that higher pressure. The arterioles have much thinner layer of smooth muscle. That's because they're just not as big. And finally, and that's there to kind of help that muscle regulate the blood pressure as well. If you have too high of a blood pressure, just that pressure itself could burst actually burst through the veins or arteries and potentially cause you to bleed out. So that's why it has to be somewhat regulated. Now, the capillary walls are usually only about 1 cell thick. But once those arterioles lead to capillary beds where those vessels are only about as wide as a red blood cell, and those capillary walls are what allow the water and other substances to easily diffuse through the rest of the body tissue. They're so thin, and that's what gives them that ability to quickly diffuse things in and out. Once you go through those capillaries, you're going to go back into the veins. Those capillary beds specifically are going to lead to the venules, which then turn ultimately into those larger veins. It's kind of like a webbing system. You have one big artery, it branches out to a bunch of arterioles, and then it branches out to those capillary systems. Then that's going to go back to the venules, the veins, a single vein back to your heart. Now, blood pressure in the veins is a lot lower, so the veins can function with less smooth muscle than the arteries. Also, unlike arteries, veins will collapse when they're empty. So without much of that smooth muscle, and since pressure is usually low, the veins will collapse when they're not full of blood. It's what often makes it kind of difficult to draw blood from certain parts of your body, depending on what kind of connection you have there. Those valves are going to be there to help keep the blood flowing backwards in veins, and thus skeletal muscle contractions are going to help propel those blood through that open valve towards the heart. There's just an extra specialized tissue there to kind of help keep your veins open as much as possible, as well as kind of pushing that blood back because it takes a little bit more effort. What exactly is blood pressure now that we come through? Blood pressure is simply the force that the blood exerts on the vessel walls. And it can be measured using that is a ridiculous word. The cuff that you see in every freaking pharmacy represents, right? And what it's looking for, and it's going to measure the systole and the diastole. Now, that higher reading, which is called the systole, is going to reflect the pressure in the arteries when the ventricles contract. Whereas the diastole is that lower reading is going to reflect the pressure of the arteries when the ventricles relax. And again, we're primarily concerned about the arteries, right? Because those are the ones that are going to maintain that more constant pressure and thus be more likely to rupture through the channel. So think about it like the 140 over 80 or 120 over 40, something like that is that upper number is that systole and that lower number is diastole. Now, vessels differ massively in the different kinds of blood pressure and velocity that they maintain, and it's going to decrease with distance from the heart. So arteries and veins that are closer to your heart are going to have much higher blood pressure versus the ones that don't. As blood velocity is lowest, it's out of the capillaries. Ultimately, this negative feedback loop is going to be there to regulate that short-term blood pressure and ultimately keep your heart and your blood vessels functioning the way they should be. This is primarily controlled through the medulla, which is the autonomic nervous system, which is going to adjust both your heart rate as well as the diameter of your arterioles using that smooth muscle to maintain that homeostasis. The arteriole diameter is what's going to be actually regulating blood pressure. So during vasoconstriction, which is the narrowing of the blood vessels, that's going to occur when the smooth muscles in the atriole walls contract. And when those atriole diameter decreases, the blood pressure increases. It's kind of like if you ever like messed around with a hose, the more you kind of decrease the size of that opening, the faster it's going to come out and the stronger that force is when it comes out, right? Then you have vasodilation, which is the widening of those blood vessels. And that's going to occur when the muscles relax and it's going to decrease pressure. Not only is this controlled by the heart, usually just to give you a little bit less blood pressure. This can be artificially stimulated doing things like drinking alcohol. So if you ever felt really warm while even though it's like stupid cold outside while you're drinking, what's happening is your body is relaxing those atrioles, and as a result, you're experiencing vasodilation. And as your arteries and veins are more and more opened up, they're usually closer to the surface, and you feel colder, or sorry, you feel warmer because your skin is actually feeling that heat that's coming from the rest of your body more. Now let's kind of jump more back into the respiratory system here. Gas exchange is going to occur in the respiratory system. Gas can be exchanged primarily through cross-body surfaces via tubules, which are connected to the atmosphere, as well as across gills or lungs. And you can kind of see a different example of this. So things like worms, a lot of well, where they just can rush fire through their actions. You understand things like a lot of your insects and arachnids and things like that will have tubules, which are kind of like if you took a gill and turned it inside out and kind of stuffed it into your body, so that way you can still maintain and have the ability to do that. You get things like gills and fish. One of the reasons why you need to be kind of careful if you're out catching fish and not damage them, so that way they can still live. And then finally, your classic ones like you see in humans, vertebrates, whatever. Now, all three respiratory surfaces have three similarities. Somewhere ultimately is, you know, sometimes internally, so that way they can continue to take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. For instance, one of the reasons why all that air that's coming back out of your lungs, you're releasing that moisture with it. Because it has to have that moist surface, or you're not going to be able to actually take in or release those various gases. Now, the human respiratory system is there to deliver air to the lungs. That respiratory system is a continuous network of tubules that ultimately deliver oxygen to the circulatory system and unloads carbon dioxide into the lungs. Now, several different types of tissue are going to make up the respiratory system. Again, epithelial, connective, nervous, and muscle. Epithelial there is more there for the diffusion across the walls of the alveoli. The connective are things like blood, so it can move the actual gases in and out of the body from that lung point. Cartilage, which is going to make up part of the nose, trachea, bronchi, and larynx. The nervous tissue, which is there to control all of these things. Finally, the muscle tissue, which is actually going to have those strong contractions of your lungs, which are going to allow you to breathe. Now, breathing usually starts in the upper respiratory system, at least in vertebrates. The air is going to enter your respiratory system through either your nose or your mouth, and then pass through your pharynx. Now, this pharynx and the mouth are part of the digestive system and the respiratory system. And since both food and air can pass through them, it kind of causes issues, right? If you choke on something because you're eating it poorly and you didn't chew your food, it's going to block your airways and then you can't breathe and you die, right? As for respiratory system is going to produce something called mucus. Because obviously, as you're kind of walking around outside, particularly in more drier and dustier environments, things like dust and other inhaled particles are going to get trapped And that mucus is used to kind of sweep that out and keep that from going into your lungs, so that way you can keep that as clean as possible. Coughing is what actually brings that mucus up to either be spit out or swallowed, and patients with cystic fibrosis often have issues with this, where their mucus that they create is so sticky and thick that kind of just coats their lungs to the point that they have trouble breathing. The lungs are the main respiratory organ here. The trachea branch into 2 bronchi, and each one is going to lead to a different lobe of the lung. The bronchi branch repeatedly into bronchioles within the lung, and those autonomic nervous systems are going to control the contraction of the muscles in the bronchioles to adjust the airflow as needed. Now, gas exchange is going to occur at the very tip of each one of these alveolus. Depends on if it's plural or singular. Alveolus is a tiny sac with a wall of epithelial tissue that is 1 cell layer thick, again, very similar to capillaries. And as a result, oxygen and CO2 diffuse through these very thin walls rather readily. And those alveoli and all their neighboring capillaries are going to take in the oxygen and remove the carbon dioxide. Now, breathing ultimately requires pressure changes. Positive pressure, or you can create negative pressure. Humans and birds use negative pressure. So when you're drawing air into your body through your diaphragm, what your diaphragm is doing is it's pulling down the muscle in your body cavity. And as it does it, it creates a negative pressure system that sucks all that air up into your lungs. And then as it relaxes, it releases that air back out. Ultimately is going to enter the body when the chest cavity expands, making the pressure inside of the lungs lower than the pressure outside of the body. And then as you're exhaling, the air is going to leave your body when your chest cavity sinks back as your diaphragm moves back up, and it makes the pressure outside of your body lower than the pressure inside of your lungs. You can artificially generate ventilators, which are there to blow air into the lungs. And as a result, because it's not that negative pressure, right? You're not generating it internally, you're using positive pressure to push air in. It can actually be damaging to the lungs if you're on them for too long. One of the things they learned early on with COVID is that the longer you're on a respirator for COVID, the more likely you are to not ever get off of it. And the reason for that is because of the way that COVID interacted with this particular treatment, it damaged the lungs enough that once you're using respirator to push a lot of air into the people and to keep their oxygen levels up, it's damaging the lungs to the point of no return. So you can kind of dark. But that's why it's really important to kind of be paying attention to those things. Ultimately, how does this air flow through the human respiratory system? Pretty straightforward. Expands the chest cavity. Air flows into the body through the nose and mouth, into the trachea, to the bronchus, the bronchioli, and finally down to the alveoli, way down here at the actual bottom of the lungs, and all these at the end of all these little branches. The gas exchange is going to occur in that alveoli, and finally, the relaxation of that diaphragm is going to shrink the chest cavity, and all that air is going to flow out. Ultimately, oxygen and CO2 diffuse in the opposite directions, with the gas exchange in the alveoli at the body's other tissues relying on simple diffusion. The oxygen diffuses into the blood at the alveoli and diffuses out of the blood at the tissue cells, whereas the CO2 enters the blood at the tissue cells and diffuses out of the environment at the alveoli. Now, blood is going to be carrying oxygen and CO2 in very different ways. Obviously, we kind of talked about hemoglobin a little bit already, but that hemoglobin that's in red blood cells is there as a protein that's going to bind to that oxygen. Now, that hemoglobin can carry some CO2, but it does not bind to this gas as readily as it binds to oxygen. It's kind of a little bit of a weird quirk in it, and it helps them to do things. Instead, the enzymes in the red blood cell are going to convert most of the CO2 to bicarbonate ions, and that ultimately is going to cause that bicarbonate to diffuse into the blood and make your blood more acidic. You can actually see this reaction here play out, whereas you add that CO2 to the water, it creates that carbonic acid, and ultimately the way your blood knows, or your body knows that you have too much CO2 in your body, is it feels like being more. Now, all of this is controlled through a negative feedback loop, where basically your body is told you either need to increase or decrease your breathing regulation depending on the acidity of your blood, as well as the lack of oxygen in your body in other places. We'll skip past that review question here because we're out of time. And as a reminder, as always, this is due on Sunday. Exam 2 is next Friday. Make sure you're prepared for the review.